The auctioneer's gavel cracked against wood like a gunshot, and 23-year-old Catherine Monroe felt her stomach drop as she realized her stepfather had just sold her like livestock to the highest bidder in a saloon packed with rough men who smelled of whiskey and tobacco. It was 1878 in Dodge City, Kansas, and the frontier town buzzed with the kind of lawlessness that allowed desperate men to do terrible things, though what her stepfather had orchestrated tonight went beyond anything she had imagined possible even in this wild corner of America. The man who won the bidding stood slowly from his corner table, his tall frame unfolding with a natural grace that seemed at odds with the rough company surrounding him. And as he walked toward the makeshift stage where she stood trembling in her faded calico dress, Catherine searched his face for some hint of the cruelty she expected to find there. His eyes were a startling shade of blue against his sun-bronzed skin, and unlike the leering expressions of the other men who had called out their bids with increasing fervor, his face remained impassive as he climbed the 3 wooden steps to stand beside her. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and broad shoulders that stretched the fabric of his work shirt. Her stepfather, Harold Garrett, rushed forward with an oily smile plastered across his florid face, his hand extended to shake on the deal that would net him $200 and rid him of the burden he had called her since marrying her mother 5 years ago. "Pleasure doing business with you, mister," Harold said, his words slightly slurred from the whiskey he had been drinking all evening to celebrate his impending windfall. "She is a hard worker, I can promise you that, and she knows how to cook and clean and all them womanly things." The cowboy ignored Harold's outstretched hand entirely, his gaze fixed on Catherine's face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What is your name?" he asked, and his voice was lower and quieter than she had anticipated, with a slight drawl that suggested origins further south. "Catherine," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the disappointed grumbling of the men who had lost the auction. "Catherine Monroe." "My name is James Thornton," he said, then turned to Harold with an expression that had gone cold as winter wind across the prairie. "I will give you your money outside. Miss Monroe, please wait here." Before Catherine could respond, James had descended the steps and was walking toward the door, leaving Harold to scurry after him like a dog following scraps. The other men in the saloon began to disperse, some casting looks of pity in her direction while others simply returned to their card games and drinks, as though nothing unusual had transpired. Catherine remained frozen on the stage, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white, wondering what fate awaited her now that she belonged to a stranger who had paid $200 for the privilege of owning her. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete who had known her mother before consumption took her 2 years ago, approached with a glass of water. "Drink this, girl," he said gruffly. "You look like you are about to faint." Catherine accepted the glass with shaking hands and took a small sip, though her throat felt so tight she could barely swallow. "Why did he pay so much?" she asked. "Some of the other men were bidding half that." Pete shrugged, his expression troubled. "James Thornton is not like the others. He has a ranch about 10 miles west of here, runs cattle and breaks horses. I have never known him to be cruel or dishonest, but I cannot speak to why he would participate in something like this." He shook his head. "Your stepfather is a wicked man, Catherine. Your mother would be ashamed of what he has done tonight." The door to the saloon swung open and James returned alone, his face still set in those hard lines that revealed nothing of his thoughts. He walked directly to Catherine and said, "We are leaving. Do you have belongings you need to collect?" "I have a bag at my stepfather's house," she said, then hesitated. "Where is he?" "Gone," James said shortly. "Do you want to retrieve your things or leave them?" Catherine thought of the small room she had occupied in Harold's ramshackle house on the edge of town, the narrow bed with its thin mattress and the battered trunk that held her few possessions. She had 3 dresses, a shawl her mother had knitted, a book of poetry, and a silver locket containing a portrait of her parents from happier days. "I want my things," she said, lifting her chin despite her fear. "They belong to my mother." Something shifted in James's expression, a brief softening around his eyes. "Then we will get them. Come." He offered his arm as though they were attending a church social rather than departing a saloon where she had just been sold. And after a moment of confusion, Catherine placed her hand in the crook of his elbow. His arm was solid beneath her fingers, all muscle and strength, and she felt a strange sense of safety despite the circumstances. They walked out into the cool September night, where stars scattered across the sky like diamonds spilled on black velvet, and the sounds of Dodge City's nightlife echoed from every direction. James led her to where a fine bay horse stood tied to the hitching post, its coat gleaming in the lamplight spilling from the saloon windows. He untied the reins and began walking, keeping his pace slow enough that Catherine could match it in her worn boots. Neither of them spoke as they made their way through the dusty streets toward the shabby house where Harold had brought her to live after her mother's death. And Catherine found herself grateful for the silence, because she had no idea what to say to this man who now held her future in his hands. The house was dark when they arrived, and Catherine realized with a mixture of relief and bitterness that Harold had not returned here after receiving his payment. Perhaps he had gone to one of the other saloons to drink away his earnings, or perhaps he had left town entirely, his obligation to his dead wife's daughter finally discharged. She pushed open the door, which Harold never bothered to lock, and lit the oil lamp in the front room with matches from the mantelpiece. "I will only be a moment," she said, and hurried to her small room before James could reply. Her hands moved quickly in the lamplight as she opened the trunk and began pulling out her belongings. The 3 dresses folded neatly, the shawl still smelling faintly of the lavender water her mother had favored, the book with its cracked leather binding, and finally the locket that she fastened around her neck. She found an old carpetbag in the corner and stuffed everything inside, then paused to look around the room one final time. She had been miserable here, counting the days until she might save enough money from taking in washing and mending to buy a train ticket to somewhere, anywhere else. Now she was leaving, though not in any way she could have anticipated. When she returned to the front room, James was standing by the window looking out at the street, his posture alert as though watching for trouble. He turned when he heard her footsteps and his gaze dropped to the carpetbag. "Is that everything?" he asked. "Yes," Catherine said. "I do not have much." He nodded and opened the door, waiting for her to precede him outside. Once they were both on the street again, he took the carpetbag from her hand despite her protest and secured it to his saddle with practiced efficiency. Then he surprised her by leading the horse rather than mounting, gesturing for her to walk beside him as they headed west out of town. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes in silence, the lights and sounds of Dodge City fading behind them until there was nothing but darkness and the whisper of wind through prairie grass. Catherine's confusion had been growing with each step, and finally, she could contain her questions no longer. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Why are we walking instead of riding?" James glanced at her, his face barely visible in the starlight. "My ranch is too far to walk tonight. There is a hotel about a mile from here, run by a respectable woman named Mrs. Patterson. You will stay there tonight, and tomorrow I will take you wherever you want to go." Catherine stopped walking so abruptly that she stumbled, and James reached out to steady her with his free hand. "I do not understand," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You paid $200 for me, and now you are taking me to a hotel." "I did not pay for you," James said, and there was an edge to his voice now, something almost angry. "I paid to stop any of those other men from getting their hands on you. What your stepfather did tonight was wrong, Miss Monroe, and I will not profit from his wickedness. Tomorrow you can decide what you want to do and where you want to go, and I will help you get there if I can." Catherine stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. "You are setting me free." She asked slowly, "Just like that?" "You were never mine to free," James said. "You are a human being, not property, regardless of what Harold Garrett tried to claim. Now come on, we should keep moving." "Mrs. Patterson will be awake for another hour or so, and she will give you a clean room and a hot meal." They began walking again, and Catherine felt tears burning behind her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. She had spent the entire evening in a state of terror, imagining all the horrible fates that might await her, and now this stranger was telling her she could simply go free as though the auction had never happened. It seemed impossible, too good to be true, and yet his voice had rung with sincerity. "Why did you bid?" she asked after a few minutes. "If you did not want to buy me, why participate at all?" James was quiet for so long that Catherine thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly as though he was choosing them with care. 5 years ago, I was engaged to be married. Her name was Sarah, and she was the daughter of a rancher north of here. A week before our wedding, her father lost everything in a bad cattle deal and fell into debt with some men who did not care how they collected what they were owed. They took Sarah as payment, and by the time I found out what had happened and tracked them down, she was already dead. He paused, and Catherine heard him take a deep breath. "When I heard what your stepfather was planning tonight, I knew I could not stand by and let the same thing happen to someone else." "I am sorry," Catherine whispered, her heart aching for the pain she heard beneath his carefully controlled words. "That is a terrible thing to have endured." "It was a long time ago," James said, though his tone suggested the wound was still raw. "But it taught me that sometimes the only way to stop evil is to meet it head-on, even if the cost is high." They crested a small rise, and Catherine saw lights in the distance, the warm glow of windows in what appeared to be a substantial 2-story building. As they drew closer, she could make out the sign reading Patterson's Hotel and Restaurant, painted in neat letters above a wide front porch. James tied his horse to the post outside and retrieved Catherine's carpetbag, then held the door open for her to enter. The interior was clean and welcoming, with polished wooden floors and whitewashed walls decorated with simple landscape paintings. A woman in her 50s emerged from a door behind the front desk, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her sharp eyes taking in the scene before her with obvious curiosity. "James Thornton," she said, her voice carrying a note of surprise. "I did not expect to see you tonight. Who is this?" "Mrs. Patterson, this is Miss Catherine Monroe," James said. "She needs a room for the night with a lock on the door and a hot meal if you have anything left from supper. I will pay whatever the cost, Mrs." Patterson's gaze moved between James and Catherine saw understanding dawn in the older woman's expression. "I heard about the disgraceful business at the saloon tonight," she said, her mouth tightening with disapproval. "Harold Garrett ought to be horsewhipped for what he tried to do." "Come here, child." She came around the desk and took Catherine's hands in her own, which were warm and calloused from hard work. "You are safe here," she said firmly. "I have a lovely room on the 2nd floor with a bolt on the inside of the door, and there is still beef stew and fresh bread in the kitchen. Let me get you settled, and then you can eat and rest." "Thank you," Catherine managed, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. "I appreciate your help." Mrs. Patterson patted her hands and then picked up the carpetbag, gesturing for Catherine to follow her up the stairs. Catherine glanced back at James, who remained standing by the desk, and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked, suddenly afraid that he would disappear and she would wake to find this had all been some strange dream. "I will be here at 9 o'clock, he promised. "Get some rest, Miss Monroe. You have had a difficult night." Catherine followed Mrs. Patterson up the stairs and down a hallway to a room at the far end. The older woman opened the door and lit the lamp inside, revealing a space that seemed almost luxurious after the cramped quarters Catherine had endured at Harold's house. There was a real bed with a thick mattress and colorful quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a small table with 2 chairs, and even a rag rug on the floor. A window looked out over the dark prairie, and Catherine could see stars hanging low on the horizon. "The privy is out back, but there is a chamber pot under the bed," Mrs. Patterson said, setting the carpet bag on the table. "I will bring up your supper in just a few minutes. Is there anything else you need?" "No, this is wonderful," Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." After Mrs. Patterson left, Catherine sank down onto the bed and finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came in great shuddering sobs that she muffled against her hands, all the fear and tension of the evening pouring out now that she was alone. She cried for her mother, who had loved Harold once and never suspected what kind of man he truly was. She cried for herself and the humiliation of being put on that stage like an animal at market. And she cried with relief that James Thornton had been there, that he had paid that money not to own her but to save her, and that tomorrow she would have a choice about her own future, by the time Mrs. Patterson returned with a tray of food. Catherine had composed herself enough to wash her face at the basin and sit down at the little table. The stew was rich and hearty, the bread still warm from the oven, and there was even a slice of apple pie for dessert. Catherine ate slowly, savoring each bite and trying to remember the last time she had enjoyed a meal without Harold's criticism or complaints poisoning her appetite. Mrs. Patterson lingered in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. "James Thornton is a good man," she said abruptly. "One of the best I have known in my 40 years on the frontier. If he has offered to help you, you can trust his word." "I barely know what to think," Catherine admitted. "A few hours ago I believed my life was over, and now I am sitting in this beautiful room eating wonderful food and being told I can go wherever I want tomorrow. It does not seem real." "It is real enough," Mrs. Patterson said. "The question is, what will you do with this second chance?" "Do you have family somewhere, friends who might take you in?" Catherine shook her head. "My mother was an only child and both her parents died before I was born. My father was killed in a logging accident when I was 12, and his family back east wanted nothing to do with us. My mother married Harold 3 years later because she thought we needed a man to provide for us, but he turned mean after the wedding and worse after she died. I have been alone since then." "You are not alone now," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "You have choices, even if you cannot see them all yet. Sleep on it tonight, and things may look clearer in the morning." After the older woman left, Catherine finished her meal and then changed into her nightgown, grateful to be out of the dress she had worn during that horrible auction. She slid between the clean sheets and pulled the quilt up to her chin, expecting to lie awake for hours replaying everything that had happened. Instead, exhaustion claimed her almost immediately, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep that lasted until sunlight streamed through the window the next morning. When Catherine woke, she lay still for several minutes trying to orient herself. The events of the previous night seemed even more surreal in the light of day, but the comfortable bed and the unfamiliar room proved that at least some of it had been real. She rose and washed, then dressed in her best remaining dress, a dark blue cotton that her mother had helped her sew 2 years ago. She brushed out her long brown hair and pinned it up carefully, then fastened her mother's locket around her neck where she could feel its reassuring weight. Mrs. Patterson had left a tray with coffee and biscuits outside her door, and Catherine brought it inside to eat while she waited for 9 o'clock to arrive. She found herself both eager and anxious to see James again, wanting to thank him properly for what he had done while also fearing that perhaps he had reconsidered his offer of help in the cold light of day. Men changed their minds, as her mother's marriage to Harold had proven, and Catherine knew better than to count on anyone's promises. But when she came downstairs at precisely 9 o'clock, James was waiting in the hotel lobby just as he had said he would be. He had changed his clothes from the night before and now wore clean denim trousers, a dark shirt, and a leather vest, with a hat in his hands that he had obviously removed upon entering. He stood when he saw her on the stairs, and Catherine noticed that Mrs. Patterson was watching them both with interest from behind her desk. "Good morning, Miss Monroe," James said. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Catherine admitted. "And please call me Catherine. After what you did last night, formality seems unnecessary." A slight smile touched his lips, the first she had seen from him. "Then you should call me James. Have you had breakfast?" "Mrs. Patterson was kind enough to leave me coffee and biscuits," Catherine said. "James, I want to thank you again for what you did. I know $200 is a great deal of money and I cannot begin to repay you." "I do not want repayment," James said firmly. "I told you last night I did what needed to be done. Now, have you given any thought to where you would like to go, what you would like to do?" Catherine descended the rest of the stairs and stood before him, acutely aware that Mrs. Patterson was listening to every word even as she pretended to write in her ledger. "I have been thinking about it all morning," she said slowly. "The truth is, I have nowhere to go and no one who would welcome me. I could try to find work in another town, I suppose, but I have no references and little experience beyond cooking and cleaning and taking in laundry. I do not even have enough money for a train ticket." "What would you want to do if you could do anything?" James asked, and the question surprised her because no one had ever asked her that before. Catherine considered carefully before answering. "I would want a place of my own," she said finally. "Not much, just a little house where I could be safe and make my own decisions. I would want honest work that paid enough to support myself. And someday, perhaps, I would want a family, though I know that may be too much to hope for." James was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those startling blue eyes. "My ranch has a house that I built with my own hands 3 years ago," he said. "It is nothing fancy, but it is solid and warm. I also have a small cabin that I used to live in before I finished the main house. It needs some work, but it is sound enough. If you wanted, you could stay there and work for me as my housekeeper. I would pay you fair wages and you would have your privacy and independence. When you saved enough money, you could leave and go wherever you wanted or stay as long as you needed." Catherine stared at him, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. "You would trust me in your home, give me work and wages after paying so much for me last night." "I would trust you," James said simply. "And the money is gone either way, so there is no sense dwelling on it. What matters is what happens now. You need a safe place and honest work, and I need help running my household. My foreman's wife used to do the cooking and cleaning, but they moved to Colorado last month to be near her family. I have been living on burned bacon and stale bread ever since." Despite everything, Catherine found herself laughing at the rueful expression on his face. "I suppose I could do worse than cooking for a man who saved my life," she said. "But I want to be clear that I will work for my wages. I will not be a charity case." "I would not offer if I did not need the help," James assured her. "So you will come?" Catherine took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, I will come and work for you, at least for now. And James, thank you, truly." Mrs. Patterson emerged from behind her desk with a satisfied expression. "A wise decision," she announced. "James Thornton runs the finest ranch in this part of Kansas, and he treats his employees fairly. You will be safe there, Catherine." They settled the bill for the room and meal, with James insisting on paying despite Catherine's protests, and then went outside to where his bay horse waited patiently at the hitching post. James secured Catherine's carpetbag to the saddle again, then surprised her by producing a gentle-looking mare from the hotel's small stable. "Mrs. Patterson rents out horses to travelers," he explained. "I arranged for this one early this morning so you would not have to walk or ride double. Her name is Bess, and she has an easy gait." Catherine had not ridden a horse in years, not since her father had owned a plow horse that he sometimes let her sit on as a child. But she accepted James's help in mounting and found that her body remembered the basics even if her muscles were out of practice. They set off heading west, riding side by side through the open country that stretched in every direction beneath a sky so blue, it almost hurt to look at. The landscape was beautiful in its starkness, all rolling prairie grass interspersed with occasional stands of cottonwood trees along creek beds. Cattle dotted the distance, and once they saw a small herd of pronghorn antelope that bounded away at their approach. James pointed out landmarks as they rode, explaining which sections were part of his property and which belonged to neighboring ranchers. He spoke easily about the land and the work, and Catherine found herself relaxing in his company despite her initial nervousness. "How did you come to own a ranch?" she asked after they had been riding for perhaps an hour. "You seem young to have built up such a substantial property." "I am 28, James said. "I came to Kansas from Texas when I was 20 after my parents died of fever. I worked as a hired hand for several years, learning the cattle business and saving every penny I could. When I was 24, I met a man named Robert Chen who wanted to sell his land and return to California. He had about 500 acres and a small herd, and he gave me fair terms on a loan. I paid him back in 3 years, and since then, I have been building the place up bit by bit. I have about 800 acres now and a herd of around 200 cattle." "That is impressive," Catherine said sincerely. "You must work very hard." "I do," James acknowledged, "but I have good help. I have 3 ranch hands who work for me full-time, and we hire on extra men during roundup and branding season. They are all decent fellows, and they know that any disrespect toward you will result in immediate dismissal. You do not need to fear them." Catherine appreciated the reassurance, though she still felt anxious about meeting strangers who might judge her for what had happened at the auction. "Will they know about last night?" she asked quietly. "They will know that I hired you as my housekeeper and that you are to be treated with respect," James said. "What happened before is no one's business but yours. If anyone in town or elsewhere gives you trouble about it, you tell me immediately. Harold Garrett may have gotten away with selling you, but he will not get away with spreading lies or gossip that might harm your reputation." His protectiveness warmed something inside Catherine's chest that had been cold for a very long time. She studied his profile as they rode, noting the strong line of his jaw and the small scar above his left eyebrow that she had not noticed in the dimmer light of the previous evening. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, but more than that, he seemed genuine and kind, qualities that were far more valuable on the frontier than good looks. They reached the ranch just before noon, and Catherine felt a surge of surprise at the sight that greeted her. She had expected something rustic and barely functional, but James's property was well-maintained and clearly prosperous. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built from lumber rather than sod, with a wide front porch and real glass windows. A barn stood nearby, along with a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, several corrals, and various other outbuildings. The small cabin James had mentioned sat about 100 yards from the main house, tucked beneath a grove of cottonwood trees with a view of the creek that ran through the property. 3 men emerged from the barn as they approached, and James raised a hand in greeting. He dismounted and then came to help Catherine down from her horse, his hands steady at her waist as she slid to the ground. Her legs were shaky from the unaccustomed riding, and she was grateful for his support. "Boys, this is Miss Catherine Monroe," James announced when the ranch hands had gathered near. "She is my new housekeeper and will be living in the cabin. Catherine, this is Tom Baker, Billy Wright, and Miguel Santos." Tom was perhaps 40, with graying hair and a weathered face that creased into smile lines when he tipped his hat to her. Billy was younger, probably close to Catherine's age, with red hair and freckles across his sunburned nose. Miguel appeared to be in his 30s, with dark eyes and a quiet dignity in his bearing. All 3 men greeted her politely, and Catherine relaxed slightly when she saw only friendly curiosity in their faces rather than judgment or suspicion. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Monroe," Tom said. "We have been living on the boss's cooking for the past month, so you are a welcome sight indeed." I am not that bad, James protested, though his eyes glinted with humor. You burned the beans so badly last week that we had to throw out the pot, Billy pointed out. I think Miguel actually cried. I did not cry, Miguel said with quiet dignity. But it was a good pot, and it deserved a better fate. Catherine found herself laughing at their easy banter, and some of the tension she had been carrying in her shoulders began to ease. I promise to do my best not to burn anything, she said. Though I should warn you that I am also still learning. My mother was the truly talented cook in our family. Anything is better than what we have been eating, Tom assured her. Now, should we show her to the cabin, boss? I will take care of it, James said. You boys can get back to whatever you were doing. Catherine and I will see you at supper. The ranch hands dispersed, and James retrieved Catherine's carpetbag from his saddle before leading her toward the small cabin. It was constructed from logs rather than lumber, with a stone chimney at one end and a single window beside the door. James pushed the door open and stepped back to let her enter first. The interior was a single room, perhaps 15 feet square, with a fireplace along one wall, a narrow bed in the corner, a small table with 2 chairs, and some shelves built into the wall for storage. It was dusty from disuse and clearly needed cleaning, but Catherine could see the quality of the construction in the tight joints and level floor. A small stove stood near the fireplace for cooking, and there were even hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. I know it is not much, James said, sounding almost apologetic. But like I said, it is sound. I can help you clean it today, and I have some extra furniture in the barn that we can bring over, blankets and dishes and such as well. It is perfect, Catherine said and meant it. The cabin was small, but it was hers, at least for now. She would have privacy and independence, something she had not truly possessed since her mother's death. This is more than I could have hoped for, James. Thank you. They spent the rest of the afternoon making the cabin livable. James hauled water from the creek so Catherine could scrub the floor and walls, and he brought over a trunk containing linens, blankets, dishes, and cooking supplies. Tom appeared with a rag rug for beside the bed and a crate of food staples from the main house's pantry. By late afternoon, the cabin had been transformed into a cozy space that Catherine could genuinely call home. I should start preparing supper, Catherine said, surveying the provisions they had assembled. What time do you usually eat? Around 6, James said. But do not feel obligated to start work today. You have been through a lot and you need time to rest and adjust. I would rather keep busy, Catherine admitted, and I need to earn my keep. What do you usually serve? How many people am I cooking for? 5, James said. Myself and the 3 hands. We usually eat together in the main house, nothing fancy, just good hearty food, beef or pork, beans, bread, vegetables when we have them. I have chickens, so there are always eggs for breakfast. Catherine nodded, mentally planning a menu from the supplies at hand. I can manage that. Why do you not show me the kitchen and then I can get started? The kitchen in the main house was better equipped than Catherine had expected, with a large iron stove, a good supply of pots and pans, and a larder well stocked with flour, sugar, salt, coffee, and other necessities. James showed her where everything was kept and then excused himself to attend to ranch work, leaving Catherine alone to begin her first meal. She fell into the familiar rhythms of cooking with a sense of relief, letting her hands remember the skills her mother had taught her. She made a large pot of beef stew using meat from the cold cellar, with potatoes, carrots, and onions she found in the larder. She mixed up biscuits from scratch and put them in the oven to bake, then brewed a large pot of coffee. By 6 o'clock, the kitchen smelled wonderful and Catherine had set the large table in the adjacent dining room with 5 places. The men trooped in at precisely 6, having washed up at the pump outside, and Catherine saw their eyes light up at the sight and smell of the food. She served them generous portions and then hesitated, unsure if she was expected to eat with them or retire to her cabin. "Sit down, Catherine," James said, gesturing to the empty chair beside his. "You cooked it, so you should enjoy it too." Catherine sat, still feeling self-conscious, but the men fell on the food with such enthusiasm that it was impossible not to feel pleased by their reaction. Tom declared it the best meal he had eaten in months, and Miguel asked politely if there might be seconds. Even Billy, who seemed naturally shy, thanked her twice and complimented the biscuits. "This is wonderful," James said quietly, catching her eye. "Truly, you have a real talent." "My mother taught me well," Catherine said, feeling a bittersweet pang at the memory. She believed that feeding people was an act of love and that every meal should be made with care. Over the next few weeks, Catherine settled into a routine at the ranch that brought her more peace than she had known in years. She rose early each morning to prepare breakfast for the men, then spent her days cleaning, cooking, doing laundry, and tending to the other endless tasks required to maintain a household. The work was hard but satisfying, and for the first time since her mother's death, Catherine felt truly useful and appreciated. James was an ideal employer, always respectful and considerate of her needs. He paid her wages promptly each week, a sum that seemed generous to Catherine even though James insisted it was standard. He never entered her cabin without permission, and he made sure the ranch hands understood that Catherine was to be treated with the utmost respect. The hands themselves proved to be good men who appreciated her cooking and often went out of their way to help her with heavier tasks like hauling water or splitting kindling. But it was James himself who occupied more and more of Catherine's thoughts as the days passed. She found herself watching for him throughout the day, noting the way he moved with unconscious grace despite his size, the way he spoke gently to the horses he trained, the way he treated everyone on his ranch with fairness and dignity. He often lingered in the kitchen after meals, talking with her about the ranch or asking about her day, and Catherine discovered that conversation with him came easily in a way it never had with other men. One evening in early October, about 3 weeks after her arrival, James appeared at her cabin door just as the sun was setting. Catherine had been sitting outside on the small bench he had built for her, enjoying the cool evening air and the brilliant colors painting the western sky. She stood when she saw him approaching, her heart beating a little faster the way it always did in his presence now. "I hope I am not disturbing you," James said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I wanted to ask if you might like to go riding tomorrow afternoon. I need to check on the herd in the north pasture, and I thought you might enjoy seeing more of the property. Only if you are interested, of course." "I would like that very much," Catherine said, pleased by the invitation. "What time should I be ready?" "Around 2, James said. "We will be back well before dark." He hesitated, then added, "Catherine, I want you to know that you have exceeded every expectation I had when I offered you this position. The house has never been better kept, the meals are wonderful, and the men are all happier than I have seen them in a long time. You have made a real difference here." Catherine felt warmth flood her cheeks at his praise. "Thank you, James. That means a great deal to me. I have been happier these past few weeks than I have been in years. You gave me back my life when you did not have to, and I will never forget that kindness." "You are the one doing me a kindness by working so hard," James said softly. "I am grateful to have you here, Catherine. More grateful than I can properly express." Their eyes met in the fading light, and Catherine felt something shift between them, some acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing steadily beneath the surface of their employer-employee relationship. James seemed to feel it too because he cleared his throat and took a step back. "I should let you rest," he said. "I will see you tomorrow." Catherine watched him walk back to the main house, her hand pressed against her chest where her heart was racing. She had sworn after her mother's marriage to Harold that she would never trust a man with her heart, never make herself vulnerable to that kind of pain. But James was different from any man she had ever known, and despite her best efforts to guard her feelings, she was falling in love with him. The next afternoon was perfect for riding, with a clear sky and a gentle breeze that kept the autumn heat from becoming oppressive. Catherine wore her best dress and braided her hair carefully, then scolded herself for caring so much about her appearance for what was simply a working ride. But when she saw James's face light up at the sight of her, she was glad she had made the effort. They rode north across the property, with James pointing out features of the land and telling her stories about the ranch's history. He showed her the water holes where the cattle gathered, the stands of timber he was preserving for future use, and the boundaries of his property. His pride in what he had built was evident in every word, and Catherine found herself moved by his passion for this land and this life he had created. They stopped beside a creek to let the horses drink, and James helped Catherine dismount. The spot was beautiful, with cottonwood trees providing shade and wildflowers blooming along the water's edge. Without discussing it, they both sat down on the grassy bank, comfortable in each other's company. "Do you ever regret coming here?" James asked after a few minutes of peaceful silence. "Do you wish you had chosen differently that morning at the hotel?" Catherine considered the question carefully. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if things had gone differently," she admitted. "If my father had not died, if my mother had not married Harold, if Harold had not sold me, but I cannot regret coming here, James. This is the first place I have felt safe and valued since my mother died. You gave me that gift, and I will always be grateful. You deserved safety and respect long before I came along," James said quietly. "No one should ever have treated you the way Harold did. No one should have to endure what you went through. But it brought me here," Catherine said, turning to look at him. "To this place, to this life, to you, and that cannot be entirely bad." James held her gaze, and Catherine saw in his eyes the same growing attachment she felt in her own heart. "Catherine," he said slowly, "I need to tell you something, though I am afraid it might make you uncomfortable. If it does, please say so, and we will never speak of it again." "Tell me," Catherine whispered, her heart in her throat. "I care for you," James said, the words coming with obvious difficulty. "More than I should, more than is appropriate given how we met and the relationship between us. I think about you constantly. I find excuses to come to the kitchen just to see you. I lie awake at night in that empty house wishing you were there. I know I have no right to feel this way, especially after what you have been through, but I cannot seem to help myself. You have brought light back into my life after years of darkness, and I am falling in love with you." Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "James," she said, reaching out to take his hand. "I feel the same way. I have been trying not to because I was afraid of being hurt again, afraid of trusting someone and having them betray me. But you are nothing like Harold or any other man I have known. You are kind and good and honorable, and yes, I am falling in love with you too." James stared at her for a long moment, as though he could not quite believe what he was hearing. Then, moving slowly to give her time to pull away if she wanted, he leaned forward and kissed her. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, and Catherine felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower opening to the sun. She kissed him back, pouring all her hope and fear and love into that single moment of connection. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. James rested his forehead against hers and said, "Catherine Monroe, you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. I do not deserve you, but if you will have me, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." "You are already worthy," Catherine said, framing his face with her hands. "You were worthy from the moment you stood up in that saloon and refused to let me be sold to evil men. You gave me back my freedom and my dignity, and now I am choosing to give you my heart. That is my choice, James, freely made." They sat by the creek for another hour, talking about their hopes and dreams, about the future they might build together. James told her about Sarah and the guilt he had carried for failing to save her, and Catherine told him about her lonely childhood and the pain of losing both her parents. They shared their scars and their fears, and in the sharing found a deeper connection than Catherine had ever thought possible. When they finally rode back to the ranch as the sun began to set, everything had changed between them. They were no longer employer and employee, not really. They were two people who had found each other against all odds, who had chosen to trust and to love despite the wounds they both carried. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened and grew. James courted Catherine properly, bringing her wildflowers he picked on his rides, sitting with her in the evenings after supper, walking with her down to the creek to watch the stars come out. The ranch hands noticed the change and approved, with Tom commenting privately to Catherine that he had never seen the boss so happy. James proposed on a cold November evening, kneeling before her in the cabin with a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. "Marry me, Catherine," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not because you work for me or because you owe me anything, but because we love each other and because we choose to build a life together. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my days making you happy." "Yes," Catherine said, pulling him to his feet and kissing him. "Yes, James, I will marry you. I will marry you because you are the best man I have ever known and because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." They were married 3 weeks later in Dodge City with Mrs. Patterson standing as witness and Tom, Billy, and Miguel in attendance. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, held in the small church on the edge of town with the circuit preacher officiating. Catherine wore a new dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew, a lovely cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, and she carried a small bouquet of dried flowers that James had carefully preserved from those he had given her throughout their courtship. As she stood beside James and spoke her vows, promising to love and honor him for the rest of her life, Catherine thought about how much had changed since that terrible night in the saloon. She had been sold like property, reduced to a commodity to be traded for money, and she had believed her life was over. But James had seen her as a person, as someone worthy of respect and freedom, and in doing so he had given her back her humanity. Now she was choosing to give herself to him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, and that made all the difference. The wedding night was tender and sweet, with James patient and gentle as he introduced Catherine to the physical side of love. He was careful with her, always making sure she was comfortable and willing, and Catherine found herself moved almost to tears by his consideration. They lay together afterward in the big bed in the main house, which was now their home, and James held her close as they talked about their future. "I want to give you everything," he whispered against her hair. "I want to make you happy every single day for the rest of our lives." "You already do make me happy," Catherine assured him. "Every day, just by being yourself. You saved me, James, in every way a person can be saved." "You saved me too," James said. "I was just existing before you came, going through the motions of life without really living. You gave me a reason to look forward to each day, a reason to build something lasting. We saved each other, Catherine." Their first year of marriage was everything Catherine had never dared to dream it could be. She loved being the mistress of the ranch, taking pride in keeping their home beautiful and welcoming. James proved to be an attentive and loving husband, always considerate of her needs and generous with his affection. They worked side by side during the day and fell asleep in each other's arms each night, and Catherine had never known such contentment. In the spring of 1879, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. She told James one evening after supper, nervous about how he would react, but his joy was immediate and complete. He swept her up into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time, and declared it the happiest day of his life since their wedding. "Are you pleased?" Catherine asked, her own eyes damp with tears. "I know we have not talked much about children." "Pleased does not begin to cover it," James said, setting her down carefully as though she had suddenly become fragile. "Catherine, you have already given me more happiness than I thought possible. A child, our child, is a blessing beyond measure." He was wonderfully attentive throughout her pregnancy, insisting that she rest more and work less, hiring a young woman from town to help with the heavier housework. Catherine protested that she was perfectly capable of managing, but secretly she appreciated his concern and care. As her body changed and grew round with their baby, She felt more beautiful and cherished than she ever had in her life. Their son was born on a cold December night, with Mrs. Patterson serving as midwife and James pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door. The labor was long and difficult, but when Catherine finally heard that first lusty cry, she knew every moment of pain had been worth it. James came in to meet his son with tears streaming down his face, and the look of wonder on his face as he held the tiny baby made Catherine fall in love with him all over again. They named him Thomas Robert Thornton, after Tom Baker, who had become a good friend, and Robert Chen, who had given James his start. Little Tommy was a healthy, vigorous baby with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, and both parents adored him completely. James proved to be a devoted father, taking time from his work to hold and rock his son, singing him silly songs and talking to him about the ranch and the cattle, as though the infant could understand every word. The years that followed brought the kind of happiness and stability that Catherine had once believed existed only in fairy tales. The ranch prospered under James's careful management, growing larger and more profitable with each passing season. Tommy grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved following his father around and helping with ranch work. Catherine gave birth to 2 more children, a daughter they named Sarah in honor of the woman James had lost, born in 1881, and another son they called David, born in 1883. The children grew up surrounded by love and security, never knowing the kind of hardship and fear that Catherine had endured. James was a wonderful father, patient and kind, but also firm when discipline was needed. He taught his sons to ride and rope and care for the land, and he taught Sarah that she was just as capable and valuable as any boy. Catherine instilled in all 3 children the importance of kindness, hard work, and treating others with respect. Tom, Billy, and Miguel remained with the ranch for many years, becoming like uncles to the children. Mrs. Patterson was a frequent visitor, always welcomed with open arms and genuine affection. The main house rang with laughter and love, filled with the sounds of children playing and the warmth of family gathered around the dinner table each evening. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the children were asleep, and she sat with James on the porch watching the stars, Catherine would think back to that terrible night in the saloon and marvel at how much her life had changed. She had been sold like livestock, stripped of her dignity and agency, and yet that moment of darkness had led her to the greatest happiness she had ever known. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked James once, during one of these peaceful interludes. "The night you bought my freedom." "Sometimes," James admitted, pulling her closer against his side. "I think about how close I came to not going to that saloon, about how I almost stayed home that evening because I was tired from a long day. If I had made that choice, your life would have been so different. Someone else would have won that auction and I never would have known you. But you did go," Catherine said softly. "You went, and you saved me, and you gave me a choice. That choice led me to you and to this beautiful life we have built together. I would not change a single thing, James, not even the painful parts, because they all led me here." "I love you, Catherine Thornton," James said, kissing the top of her head. "More now than I did on our wedding day, more than I thought it was possible to love another person. You are my partner, my love, my everything." "And you are mine," Catherine replied, tilting her face up to kiss him properly. "Forever and always you are mine." As the years passed and their children grew, Catherine and James grew old together with the same love and devotion they had shared from the beginning. They saw Tommy grow into a fine young man who eventually took over running the ranch, Sarah marry a kind schoolteacher and start her own family in town, and David head west to Colorado to start his own ranch with his father's blessing and financial support. They became grandparents, delighting in the next generation of Thorntons who ran through their house with the same energy their own children had once displayed. James's hair went gray and then white, and lines deepened around Catherine's eyes, but they still held hands like young lovers and still found joy in each other's company. On their 30th wedding anniversary, James gave Catherine a gift that made her cry. It was a leather-bound journal filled with letters he had written to her over the years, but never sent. Letters describing his love for her, his gratitude for their life together, his wonder at the family they had created. Catherine read them all through tears of joy, marveling that she had been lucky enough to find and marry such a man. "I wrote the first one the night after I met you," James explained, watching her read with obvious emotion. "I wanted to remember every moment, every feeling, in case it all disappeared. Then I kept writing year after year because putting my love into words helped me appreciate just how blessed I was." "We are blessed," Catherine said, setting the journal aside to embrace her husband. "Both of us together. You saved me that night, James, but I think I saved you too. We saved each other and we built something beautiful from that shared salvation." James held her close, his arms still strong despite his years. "The best decision I ever made was standing up in that saloon," he said quietly. "The second best was falling in love with you, and every day since has been a gift I never take for granted." They lived out their remaining years in peace and contentment, surrounded by family and friends, secure in the knowledge that their love had stood the test of time. When James finally passed away at the age of 78, with Catherine holding his hand and their children and grandchildren gathered around, his last words were, "I love you, my Catherine. Thank you for choosing me." Catherine lived another 5 years after James's death, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, and tending the ranch that had been her salvation and her home for over half a century. She told her grandchildren stories about their grandfather's heroism and kindness, making sure they understood that he had been a truly good man in an often harsh world. When her own time came, Catherine passed peacefully in her sleep in the bedroom she had shared with James for so many years. Her family buried her beside him on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the wide Kansas sky they had both loved. The epitaph on their shared headstone reads simply, "James and Catherine Thornton, beloved husband and wife, they chose love." And that choice, made in freedom and sustained through decades of devotion, had transformed two broken people into a family, a legacy, and a love story that would be remembered and cherished for generations to come. Catherine had started as a woman sold against her will, but she ended as a woman who had lived fully and loved completely, surrounded by the family and happiness she had been given the freedom to choose. It was, in the end, the most perfect happily ever after she could have imagined.